Yeah, we don't know which way anything is going to go. I guess like will
That's
people
true.
be
Yep.
shorter on Mars? There are reasons to think they might be, but there are
Yep.
also reasons to think they might be taller.
hmm
So yeah, it's sort of unpredictable. I mean, for you as a scientist, how do you even look at those questions?
No, you're right, and we have to be clear about that. We can never predict with any certainty what the future of evolution will be because. By its nature, evolution has certain aspects of stochasticity that make it not possible to predict. But we also do know that evolution has historically followed certain patterns. So, for example, you see the same type of animal evolving multiple times independently. Like, it's been kind of famous recently that like crabs or a crab-like shape has evolved multiple times repeatedly in evolutionary history. There's a lot of things that have evolved to be anteater-like. I have to bring it back to ants. That's just I'm contractually obligated. But there's a lot of different things like that where different, very distantly related species have evolved to be very similar to one another, and that tells us that, yeah, evolution has some randomness to it, but it also can fall along somewhat predictable lines. And there's even been interesting experiments that have demonstrated this using things like, cultures of bacteria to sort of see like, well, how often do you get the same thing evolving? And it turns out that sometimes it does happen sort of similar ways over and over again. So I would argue like, I think there's nothing that we can say about how we might evolve in the future. We can use what we know about how evolution works to kind of say, well, there's some things that are more likely than others, and we can look at different possible future scenarios for how we might evolve. So, I think it is important to be clear that we don't have a crystal ball and we can't say with any certainty, but we can look at basically the precedents that we have from 4.5 billion years of Earth history and the incredible richness of life on Earth, and ask like, what are the common patterns that we see, and try to apply that to these future scenarios.
Mm-hmm. And I wonder what you think about changes in the brain. Really, in reading your work, I got the idea that you said that big changes in our brain size really, rather than features, changed a lot when there was a lot of volatility in climate. So now we go to Mars where there's volatility in the whole environment. Would we expect the same thing? Would we expect brain changes? And given that we assume people are going to be born by C-section, so then there's less pressure on the head as well. What do you think about changes in the brain?
Yeah, this is really interesting because what seems to be the case is that if you look at in our history, in our evolutionary history, when as you were saying, when our sort of brains really started to rapidly expand, it coincides with a time in which the climate was very, very volatile, basically like rapidly changing. And so, it's important to point out correlation is not causation. So we can't say with any certainty that is what triggered the change in our brain size, but you can imagine that there's at least a plausible scenario in which that was one of the major factors. So under that hypothesis, it's really kind of like natural selection is favoring individuals that are good at solving problems because they can't just rely on what they've done in the past, because the environment is changing so quickly. The environment is going from, cool and dry to warm and wet, and that's affecting the vegetation and the kinds of, plants that are available to eat and use, and the kinds of prey animals that are around, and, how you can get shelter, all the different aspects of survival. If you think about, being out on the African savanna, right? So being intelligent may have been one of the kind of survival factors for our ancestors. So yeah, I think, if that's true, if that really is what drove this massive expansion in our brain that started around, 2 million years ago, then yeah, there's certainly at least a precedent for the idea that going once again into a radically different environment, and especially an environment that isn't consistent, isn't constant, but is, somewhat unpredictable, because that seems to be part of what was happening at that time, is that it was kind of this unpredictability of the environment. Being in that type of environment seems to maybe, give an advantage to individuals that are more clever, more able to solve problems.